Just this past weekend, we saw at the Melbourne Guitar Show this brand new Reload 2 from our friends at Two Notes. And I was very excited to check it out on the channel here. So I asked them very nicely and they let us borrow it so that we can bring you some info about this awesome new product from Two Notes. It is a reactive load box and it enables you to plug in amps and have them at very loud levels, say in home recording situations or live situations, and control their volume, you know, the actual loudness, which is not new by any stretch of the imagination. But one thing that Two Notes has done in this is put in a few really great features that I want to talk about today. So the first thing is the fact that this is stereo. So I have here my favorite amp, which is my own amp. This is a single channel, no effects loop, pretty much no frills kind of guitar amp. And so to be able to turn this up to kind of distortion levels means that I can't really run reverb and delay into it. Well, now I can, thanks to a stereo effects loop in this as well. It also means that I can't run this amp on its own means that I can't run two speakers. Well, thanks to the Reload 2, now I can run two speakers. In fact, I can also blend in a sort of a wet-dry mix, a wet-dry-wet mix. I have a whole lot of ins and outs. I can record directly with a line out from this. I could also plug a modular into this and use this as a sort of an amplifier going to speakers. It's amazingly versatile and they've done a great job of really making this extremely user-friendly. Another thing that I didn't notice until I sat this on top of my amp was, I already noticed that it looks cool, it looks beautiful, great addition to a studio. I did notice that it was on this slight angle, which I thought was useful if you were sitting it on your desk in front of you and were going to control it. But what I didn't think about until I put it on my amp is that that gap under there means that I can actually sit it on top of an amp just like it is now, and the handle of the amp underneath is not getting in the way, which I think is a really great little feature that Two Notes have thought about, because that's something that really is frustrating with some things when you try to put them on top of your amp and your amp handle is in the way. You're not going to get rid of your amp handle, obviously. We have, like I said, two channels on this. So my setup at the moment is that I am plugging my guitar directly into this amp, and I have the amp turned up quite loud. And so that would be, like I say, that's a great sound, a great overdriven sound, but it means I couldn't really use a reverb in front of that. And I'm going to show you what that would sound like here. So if I run my reverb into this sound, it's not going to sound amazing. And this is why effects loops are important. So first of all, here is my guitar sound. And that's no pedals or anything on, that's just the amp working really hard. I have also got my level in the room quite low, so it's manageable. But if I ran a reverb into this amp doesn't have an effects loop built into it. If I ran reverb into that, it's not going to sound amazing. Let's have a quick listen to what that sounds like. Which is not a great sound at all. So what we want to do, what a lot of amps have, is an effects loop. This amp doesn't have one, so this has a built-in stereo effects loop in the back of it. So now I can run the reverb in the effects loop of this amp through these cabs. And now that sounds much better, much more like the sort of reverb sound that we want to hear. It also means that I can run things like choruses, and it also means that I can run modulation and all sorts of things that you usually run after your preamp. The other great thing about this being is that effects loop is stereo, and I have two potential cab outputs here. I can run my effects in stereo, so at my tremolo here, I'm just going to put my trem on. Running in stereo is a beautiful thing. And then of course delays running in stereo as well. Which sounds awesome. One thing that I like to do as well is run in what we call wet dry. So I actually can have one amp that has my wet signal and one amp that is just my dry. If I turn the volume up of one, it's not necessarily the exact same amount of volume that goes up on the other, and there can be a bit of fiddling around with how loud your wet amp versus your dry amp is. If you need to make quick adjustments, you've got to adjust 2 amps. Look, it's not that big a deal, but it's annoying to quickly do on a gig or in a session. This would change that, because what it would mean is that I can control all of my level and my EQ and my preamp basically on one amp. And then I can run a wet or a dry using this, this unit here. So on the back here, I can actually put in a blend of the affected sound. So if I turn on the back here, if I turn the wet mix of one of these cabs all the way off, now my effects are only coming through one of the 2 cabs. I've got 2 cabs mic'd here. So I get this wet dry thing, which I usually use myself. I think it's a great sound. It enables you to have that kind of immediacy of your dry sound with a wet affected sound. But of course I can put them both all the way in, but with this wet all the way back. And now I have full stereo effects. I also wanted to show you a couple of setup situations that Two Notes have included. So here we have what they're calling the high performance live rig, which you can see has a preamp and an amp connected, going to different ins and outs with different effects loops for the different outputs. It's a very versatile setup. We have what they call the Studio Essential. So that has an amp switcher with different amps going to different cabs, a stereo multi-effects, and then recording direct to an audio interface. The Amp Capture Essential is what they would use, the way that you would connect for getting captures for your digital emulations of amps to put in your Quad Cortex or your Kemper. The dual mono parallel effects loops, this one was cool. I want to show you a sound of this. I have set one of these up, something like this, where I have got 2 effects loops that are giving totally different effects on the left and the right, and it sounds like this. Using a mono source to feed a stereo effects loop is what we've been doing for most of this video. A wet dry wet with 3 cabinets. If your amp has 2 cab outs, then you can send from your amp to a dry cab and use the Reload 2 for your 2 wet cabs. I also want to show you this, so feeding a mono effects loop to dual cabs. So I'm going to start by showing you the wet dry mix, which sounds like this. And then the exact same delay settings, except this time my delay in mono is going to 2 cabs, and it sounds like this. So a couple of other great features that this unit has that I want to quickly talk about. We've got this amp in level, which you can see. I can set, it's showing me whether or not I can turn it up, whether it's okay in the middle there, or whether I need to turn the amp itself down. I can trim that with this control here. What I can also do is make sure that I can see very quickly on the front here that I've got the 16 ohm selected for my amp, but you can have 4 or 8 ohms as well. And that as a light on the front is very good to know, because you don't want to be plugging your amp into the wrong load. Underneath there, you can see it says Celestion. Now this unit has the first ever Celestion approved load response. So Two Notes have worked with Celestion to make a much more accurate version of the load response that a speaker puts on an amp. And so to the point that Celestion themselves have said, yes, we think that this works in the same way that our speakers do. And so they have put their brand name on this as a kind of a backup, I guess, if you like, or a backing for Two Notes, saying this is going to do the right things that it says that it's going to do, which I think is a pretty good approval, if you like, of this unit, to have a speaker company as well known and regarded as Celestion come in and say, you know what, these guys have done a very good job of emulating what our speakers do. The other thing that we'll see here is we've got this Mojo button here. So if I have that Mojo button off, basically what it's doing is sort of running the amp as it is at the moment, which means that you could have a quiet amp and then it feels like the power tubes aren't working that much. But, just turn my effects up there. If I add in this Mojo switch, it's supposed to kind of give that feeling of the power tubes working harder, which the power tubes in my amp right now are working quite hard. But if you're running a small amp or you're running an amp at, you know, not full power, this just adds a little bit of that kind of chime and that, I don't know, that fairy dust that we as guitar players talk about when we are talking about tubes. So that's on. So you can hear an audible difference, but there is a feel difference for sure. It's the sort of button I think I would just leave on all of the time. We've also got an output control. So these big white knobs are basically how loud your cab is in the room, and the smaller output is how loud or how much level your direct XLR outputs have. So I am currently sending this, I'm micing it, both the cabs. I'm also sending 2 XLR line outs straight into my door, which I will use the Two Notes Wall of Sound plugin to get speaker emulations on that as well. And I'll do a bit of a mix between them for you to hear the sound of all of these things separately, but also blended together, because versatility is really what we want in a recording situation. I also have a depth and a presence control for both channels, which means that I can add low end or high end to a cab, and I can have it separate for the 2 different ones. So if I was running a 1x10 and I wanted a little bit more low end, I could turn my depth up. If I was running a 4x12 and it was a bit too woofy, I turn that depth down. It's a really great control, and I've kind of set these here to where I think my speakers sound good today in the room. But let's just, for the sake of it, have a listen to what that's going to do. I'm going to turn the depth of both all the way up. And then let's go all the way down. And then let's do the same thing with the presence control. So go all the way up. And then let's go all the way down on both. Now, often with those sort of controls, I find myself instantly going to an extreme and going, ugh, I would never use that sound. But even with these particular cabs that I've got in this room, I would be happy with any of those settings all the way through those controls. So I think that's awesome that they've been able to make that sound great the whole way through the range. Meaning that for different rooms or different cabs, or, you know, different nights where your ear is feeling like it's hearing things differently, you can make those adjustments and have it sound good the whole way through the range. So that's awesome. Let's talk about connectivity and versatility. In a modern setting, versatility is really the thing that we are going for. We want to be able to connect things in all sorts of different ways, to different cabs, to be able to run it directly to record, to be able to record late at night. As we film this right now my son, who is quite young, is asleep in virtually the next room. So to be able to record at a low volume but still have the amp working is an awesome feature for most of us who don't get to turn amps up. For the modern quiet stage that just sound engineers do not want loud amps on stage, this is a perfect opportunity to be able to run your amp. The other thing is that to be able to run it in stereo, this is just like bringing a second head. You know, if you had two head and cab or a combo and another speaker cabinet and this, it's not that much extra gear to bring for a huge wide stereo sound. I think it's easier than bringing a whole nother amp, to be honest. And the fact that I can control that with my one preamp on my main amp is awesome. On the back, we have a line in and a line out for both the channel A and the channel B. The line in would allow me to plug a preamp or a modular directly into here and run it out of there, use this almost as a power amp and run that into speaker cabinets, which is an amazing feature because to be able to run your sounds that you've made in your Fractal or your Line 6 or whatever modular you might be using, and just run this as a power amp is very cool. There's two cab outputs. There is a stereo effects loop on left and right. I can run them as one out coming back into two returns like a standard stereo effect. So that's how I've kind of got this wired here in what we would call the 5 cable method. So I'm going into there, through the preamp, into here, out of this unit, back into my pedal board, splitting in stereo out of my pedal board, back stereo into this, and then out of that into two cabs, which is something that this, vintage style amp cannot do on its own. So that's an awesome feature in and of itself. You also have on the back here an impedance selector switch, and you have got the ability to foot switch the effects loop as well as to be able to blend in the amount of wet effect as well. What that means is that you could almost do a quasi wet dry wet thing with this unit and just two cabs if you had your effect blended all the way to no dry or dry kill on your effects, your reverb, your delay, those sort of things. And then you actually panned them left and right and you blended the wet signal coming back into this, you would be able to sort of have a dry sound up the middle of your sound, and then in stereo have your effects on left and right, which is a huge sound. And if you've never tried wet, dry, wet, I cannot recommend it enough. But even just to be able to run in stereo, if you've never tried stereo effects and never stood in front of two amps moving back and forth at each other, it is something to behold. So just for the sake of it, I'm going to play something right now with that, and we're going to pan it hard left and right. I'm also going to switch here between my mic'd cabs in the room and also what I record, and I'll put the Two Notes wall of sound with some speaker emulations on this as well, and we'll go back between them. Always fun. And as a guitar player, if you get on stage, the best way to have a great gig is to make sure that your sound is good and it's fun to play. Stereo is the way to go. And if you've only got a vintage style amp that doesn't have an effects loop and you can't run in stereo, this is a perfect addition to your rig. So if you're running an old, low wattage Fender or something like that, or an older AC30 that doesn't have an effects loop, perfect way to add an effects loop. Perfect way to turn your AC30 up to extremely loud levels without getting evicted from your house for being at face melting volume. I wanted to show you not only what I'm using in the wall of sound here so you can hear what that is all about and see what that is all about, but talk about the Genome plugin that comes with the Reload 2 as well. But first of all, here in my Logic session, this is the Wall of Sound plugin that I am using on my two direct recorded signals. So I've got this one on my left hand side, which has a Celestion Ruby and a kind of a 4x12. And then this one on the right hand side, which has a Celestion Ruby and sort of this old Ampeg type amp, which I think sounds quite cool. So they're my two sounds that I'm using when you're hearing the direct signal. I also wanted to flick over and look at the Genome plugin. Now you get a lifetime license. When you buy a Reload 2, you get a lifetime license to the Genome plugin as well. And this is the Genome plugin here, which has a whole lot of different cabs and miking options in there as well, just the same as the Wall of Sound does. But what you also get is all of these effects and amp sounds, as well as your standalone guitar sound, if you like, so you can move your amp and put let's put a drive pedal on there, and then we've got these Dyne IR cabs. That's a cab that I had already, but let's go to various different types of cabs that come with the unit. You've got EQ, you've got all sorts of extra post effects as well that you can add in, and delay and modulation, and lots of great sounds. And you can use this as well to get sounds directly into the computer, but using your amp as a preamp. So you can run this. If I didn't have the amp on there, I could run my preamp of my actual amp into this and use the Dyne IR cab in this Genome software. In the Genome software, we get a bunch. You get 24 of their Dyne IR cabinets with it. So you get a bunch of guitar cabinets. So I'll just scan down here and you can have a look at some of them that come with it, including, of course, a bunch of Celestion speakers. So a whole lot of different sounds available to you there. You get bass cabs. So, 8x10s and, small kind of modern 210 types. You get some effects and you get different mics for every single cab as well. So it's an incredible amount of versatility in this unit. The other great thing about this is that line out, so you can record directly at home or at night or silently on a stage, all of those features which are awesome. A couple of things that I will say, I reckon Two Notes missed a tiny trick on this. The lineouts of this do not have a speaker emulation on them, which I understand why they don't, because this product would be designed to run into an emulator or the Two Notes Cab M or one of those other speaker simulator pedals. The problem that I see with that is that if you were just wanting to use this and run that at the gig and then run direct to front of house, there's another kind of two speaker simulations that you would have to have in between on this. I would have loved to have seen just a switch, just one maybe of Two Notes cab emulations that you could switch in and out on that XLR. I think that would have made this an amazing unit, and it would have been almost a perfect unit for me had it had that option on it. The other thing is that it is slightly big, but I know why it is big. It needs to take a lot of heat from the energy that it is absorbing from the amplifier, and I understand that, but it is a bigger sort of unit. But I think they make up for it by the simple but effective features that they've put on it. And the connectivity and possibilities that begin to arise with this are awesome. The fact they've put a line level input as well, meaning you can run your modeler or any preamp pedal or any preamp that you've got into this. There's lots of thought that's gone into this to make this really an effective tool. I just would have loved to have seen the ability to have just one speaker emulated output or one speaker emulated option on the two XLR outputs for this to be a great live and studio tool as well.